You want to learn two things. First of all, you want to learn how you can just implement 8 events and can already have a perfect tracking setup and can create the dashboard that really helps you to analyze your business performance. And on the second thing, you want to learn how it would look like for Airbnb. You're in the right place. We are doing this today. Hey, welcome back. So my name is Timo. I'm doing these things about how to create tracking implementation, what you should track, what are the right tracking events. Now, for quite some time, I'm doing tracking plans for over 10 years, and I learned a lot of stuff, and I did a lot of stuff wrong in the past, and I will cover this. This video is a quick wrap-up of a live session that I did. So if you want to have a longer version of all of this, just go over here in YouTube to the live streaming section and you will find the same video which I did, which runs roughly 45 minutes. And so we are trying to do this here a lot quicker because this is just a wrap up, and this is for you if you just want to have the summary of everything and not every detail. But if you want to have every detail, you go over to the other video and then you will have a full version of the live session that I did about the same thing. And so, let's look how this all looks like. Let's start. The nice title of this is I run a business with 8 events. And so why did I tell this? Because in the past, I did approach that was more derived on how people are interacting with your website or your application or your software as a service application, so whatever. And when we were creating a tracking plan for that, I usually went down and say, okay, what are the essential things that user can interact with your application and with your websites? And based on that, we created a tracking plan. The problem with this kind of approach is like you basically take all the stuff that users can do, and then you have to derive from that what is relevant for your business. Because in the end, what you want to know is like, how is my business doing? So how are my customers' journeys look like? And this is usually like a different level, and it's a different scope of things. And it's usually like a much higher level than looking how people are interacting with my stuff. And saying that, it's super interesting to see how people interact with your application, but it has a different purpose. So it's usually just relevant from some kind of time to another time, usually when a product team is working on a feature, or if you are preparing to work on a feature. So for example, an onboarding flow, then of course, like you want to collect some data, which is interesting for that. But if you focus your full tracking setup to cover everything on the product thing, on the one hand, you have to implement a lot of tracking events and you have to maintain them and they have to be in good shape. And so this can really drive you a lot crazy because you have to implement everything. You have to make sure that it stays like this. And it produces a lot of data that you then, when you go into your analysis tool or you create, I don't know, your SQL models for that, you have a lot of noise where you have to create the right signals for that. So it makes it really complicated. So what I changed over the years was like, I was more starting to focus on the business events. And then when this is in good shape, I will then introduce some kind of product specific events for specific analysis. But the business events are different. So they are really like based on what happens in your business. And so they build around your business entities. And the good thing about this is like what happens in your business and your business entities are stuff that doesn't change so much over time. So it's a totally different approach when it comes to what you want to track because you implement it once and you slightly adapt it over time. But it's not really something that you have to implement a lot of tracking stuff. You usually have it in one implementation ready because it's not so much. And it doesn't change so much because your business model does not change. And the other thing is like, you can abstract it from the front ends in the different kind of places where people interact with it. And you can just implement it in a very agnostic way. And you can decide very liberally where you basically get the tracking event data from. So you can get it from the front ends, but you can also get it from some server, or you can get it from a third-party tool, and you can just use their webhook to say, oh, well, this is actually my event. And then you can track it from there. Business events are always very relevant because this is usually the stuff that your management or your investors or everyone is asking you for. And this is also like the stuff that usually is the foundation for a company report. And so how does it look like? How does it look when you design a process for business events? And so this is what we do today. So we look into the Airbnb example, and you can already see, so if you want to see how I basically build this, hop over to the live session where I did this, and now we are just looking in the results, and I give you a little bit of context here. So now we basically pretend that we are the data team from Airbnb, and we are tasked to come up with a very core model of the stuff that we need to track. What I do in the first place is like I define the different kind of business entities that are important for me. I most likely have something like an object. And so I don't know if this is called object in Airbnb terms. This comes to the first important place. Is like if you define something like this, you have to match the language that you use within your company. So I'm pretty sure that Airbnb will call this not object, but it will call it differently. But we call it object now. And for me, an object is like the house, the apartment, a shared space, and so on. So basically the stuff that you can book. And then we have different entities. So search, for example, search is a question. Is this a single entity, or is it just a product feature? I would say search is an essential part within the Airbnb experience, because this is basically how you match people to their ideas, what they want to book, to a specific kind of object. So I would handle search as an own entity because it's an important thing. It will be optimized. So it will be really, even can happen that it will be a part of my core company reports to see how people are using the search. Then, of course, account is super important. So people have to create an account to basically rent out stuff or to publish new objects on the platform. So I have a two-sided account thing. Then I have the reservation. And so here's the same thing, reservation and booking. So is it not the same thing? It could be. So you could just say, booking is my major entity, and I don't really have a reservation. And reservation is just a state, and I put it in a property here. But I like to have it basically as own entity. So reservation for me is a pre-stage before booking. So reservation is this whole process that on a marketplace is interesting, where basically someone who wants to make a reservation and someone who basically can make the reservation happen because it's around the object. So there will be some interaction in between. I want to track it in a single entity. And then, of course, we have the booking, which is super important. And then we have the payment. And so again, payment could also be a part of the booking, just some kind of action that's happening. But since payment can be different, so Airbnb is offering different kind of payments. I can pay fully, I can pay make a split payment, and so on. So I would like to have it as a single entity. And then we have an interesting thing, like it looks like a little bit of a relic of these old tracking stuff, but don't underestimate a session. So I put in a session here, because in a session is basically an important entity if I want to track marketing activities. Because marketing activities, of course, they have an impact on the user or on the account, but usually it's just like, it can tell me what kind of marketing campaign was the last touch point before someone created an account or someone became a user. And so this is interesting for me, but it doesn't really tell me, because I usually do more marketing around it. And so what I would like to have is like, I want to have a session entity, and session entity means someone clicks on some kind of marketing stuff. So be it an email, push notification, or an ad, and then they come on the website or within the app, and then they do stuff. But I can put some marketing information to this session, so the session gets started, and then I have some marketing information here, and then I can even analyze the different kind of marketing touch points across time. So this is why a session, even when it looks like an old relic of the old analytics world, is quite an interesting entity also for the business. Because session is important for the business. If you don't have sessions, nothing happened. You can also call it a visit or so on. So it's like a terminology thing. And so you choose the one that works best in your company. And once I have the entities, I sketch out the different kind of actions. And I just did it here for the object. And I would not even say that it's now fully covering everything, but it covers the main stuff. So an object can be created. And created already is an interesting thing, because this is something that either just happens for this one account type, so for the ones who are offering objects, or for example, it can be something that happening from a backend service and so on. So it doesn't really have to happen there. And so then I have something which I have to think about if I really want to have it that split out. I can have something discovered, so someone sees an object, for example, in a list. Then I can have something like clicked, and then I have something like viewed. So this can be a sequence, and this might be already too detailed, and so maybe just ignore these ones because they are maybe too detailed already. And for me, for example, viewed is just important when someone had it. But it depends a little bit on how you create your management reports and what kind of details you want to have. I might maybe not consider these both, but it might be important for me. But then it's a decision to make. So viewed definitely is something important, so I view it. And then, of course, like saved is even more important for me, that when someone basically clicks on a button and saves an object in a list, then I can assume, okay, this person now enters a stage where they're actually really looking for stuff. And could be also like, if I'm in a growth stage, shared could be a very important thing for me, that people are share stuff. So I made this dots here to mark the core events. So it could be that, for example, in specific stages, a shared one could be a core event for me too, because it's a very important growth event. And then an object can be requested and an object can be booked. I come to this in a second, just let me do the other ones. So deleted can be something that the people who are offering some. And this, for example, is interesting, suspended or blocked. So this, for example, is an event that none of your users or customers will do. This is something that can happen from the admin side. So that, for example, you have an operations team that discovers objects that maybe have so bad ratings, or you have complaints, and so you basically block it or suspend it. But this is an important event, and so you will send it from some kind of backend services. But it's important to know. So if you want to analyze the lifetime of an object. So you put a user in the core, but you put an object in, and you make a lifetime analysis of different kind of objects. So it would be interesting to see, okay, how much has it been booked before it becomes suspended and so on. So you can do really interesting analysis if you cover this different kind of events. And so coming back to requested and booked, so they are quite interesting because they are having a concept which might be a little bit confusing in the first place, because they can have the same trigger, so one trigger that is basically triggering this, and it can be two events. But so, for example, it can be that we send the event object requested, or object reservation requested. So you can also write it like this. We don't have to be super religious here. So of course, like object reservation requested is also like a valid action that can happen. And so this can be the same. But the interesting thing is why I like, for example, to track it as two events or two contexts in the end, because if I do this, then I have it on the one time bound to the object entity. So I can make all the object-based analysis. And if I want to analyze my reservation context, and so then, for example, it's also interesting for me when a reservation has been requested. And of course, both create a context here. So if I send this event, I might also send the object event in this kind of thing. And if I start to analyze this, then I can also pull the information about the object when I analyze the reservation. But for me, it totally makes sense to have, let's say, two events which are different named, but in the end are triggered at the same place. Because in the analysis, they are different. So I make an object focus analysis, so then I need this one. And if I make a reservation focus analysis, I might need this one. And so this is why, for me, it's totally okay to have two events named differently, but basically gets triggered at the same place, because they have a different kind of context. And the same, for example, is booked. So for me, it's super interesting to see when objects get booked. But for me, of course, it's also super interesting to see how many finished bookings I have. I mean, technically, both is the same, but from a conceptual point, it's not. It's different. This might be a little bit confusing in the first place, but I can tell you, like, if you do it like this, it creates you a lot more opportunities to easily analyze stuff later on. And then what I do as well is, like, then I sketch out the different kind of properties. And so as you can already see, so objects, so all the entities here, if you define it once, it will stay pretty static. It will not really change a lot over time. The same with the kind of actions that you define. So they usually stay like this. I mean, your object will always be created and can always be viewed, and there will always be a reservation request, at least unless you change your model. And so this is quite nice. So you implement it once and there. And with the properties, it's kind of the same. So in the properties, you put all the context. And I mean, when we talk about an object on Airbnb, we can easily come up with 50 different kind of properties. And I think properties, if things are changing, then it's usually happening on the property level. But it is totally fine, because this is usually like a change that doesn't cause so much stuff, because in the end, the event stays the same. The only thing that you get is like another filter criteria that you can use. I can say, if you already have some kind of property set, it might be extended a little bit. Let's maybe it gets 3 or 4 or 5 new properties over a year, but it's not something that it's been drastically changed. And what I do is like I define the properties on the entity level, and I'm trying to use all the properties when I create the tracking stuff then for all the events for this entity, because then I'm pretty sure that I have the same context for each kind of event, which makes it easier for me later to analyze. It's not a requirement. I mean, you will have most likely something like an object ID. And so, of course, like you can derive this kind of context also like from the object ID. And so you're not totally bound to it, but sometimes it makes it really easier in some kind of tools if you provide all the context with all the different kind of events. And then there are some events which are just specific for a specific kind of action. So for example, if I have a shared action, how it is shared, so via, I don't know, email, copy link, text message, and so on. Of course, this is information that is just relevant for the shared action, so it will not get into the global properties for this entity. So I usually have then a mix between these both, so like the generic and entity-based properties and specific action-based properties. And so by that, I can create the nice context that we all love to filter down things. And that's it already. I mean, if you sit down for 2 or 3 hours with a team and so on, this is something you can easily create the first initial thing. And the nice thing about that is like, I highly recommend to then basically mark the core ones. And core one for me is like, this is the major funnel that I would look on if I want to see on one glance how my business is doing. And so I want to see, maybe if I look a little bit from the marketing perspective, I want to see how many sessions has been started. Maybe I also want to see how many objects has been viewed, how many has been saved. Created is a different flow. So, I mean, in Airbnb, I always have these 2 different flows of people adding new objects to the platform and people basically renting them out. So I might have different dots here, so at least 2 colors. So let's say the booking process would be really like, I want to see how many viewed it, saved it, requested a reservation, booked an object, or then representative this one. I can decide which one I want to put in the funnel. And then we receive the payment. And and then maybe like the booking, maybe I even want to see when the booking gets started, because then I know that everything has worked, started and ended. This is like semantic stuff that you have to discuss internally. But with that, I have 8 events that is already creating the funnel. I have the important stuff that I really need. And even when I sketch out more events that are really like my business events, to implement all this, let's say you end up with 12, 15 different kind of events, the implementation doesn't really take so long. It's really like a very straightforward process that makes it really easy to implement it once, to monitor it, to really make sure that this is there. And you can build all the important reports that you need for your investors, for your management, just based on this information. And so this makes tracking a lot easier, because in the end, you really have your core set. It doesn't really change a lot. The implementation, let's say, takes 2 or 3 weeks. And you can even implement it in a very agnostic way. So you can even say, we don't track all this stuff on some kind of front ends. We just do this in our backend services. So we pass on some information from the front end. So for example, like the session with session information, for example, which campaign was used that people end up. So we have some information that we pass on from the front ends. Also maybe like here. So I have here a field called platform. So this is the information we pass on from the front end. But the whole tracking then happens on the back end. And that makes it for you like you have one place where you basically have to make sure that you track all the things. And it then doesn't really care if you have 2 apps, I don't know, 2 different websites, I don't know, 10 different websites where you track stuff. In the end, you just track it at one point when it ends up in your backend. And so you get around all the issues that you usually have to track stuff on the front end. And this is your core thing. Once this is in place, you have a really great data setup. And then you can sit down with your product team and think about going deeper into analysis. You want to see how people use features and so on. Then you can start to do this. And there are different ways how you can do this, and I might do this in a different session. But you should have this in place to do everything. I hope this helps. I hope it motivates you to try this out for your own business. And what I will do is I will do a lot more sessions where we just take different examples. So today we did Airbnb. We might do the New York Times, Dropbox, wherever. Just pass in the comments if you have something that you like to see as an example. And so we will do this in the future. I hope this was helpful to learn how to run your business with basically 8 events. See you next time.